Hi, welcome everybody. My name is Colin Campbell, and I'm super excited to be here today with Jaemin Looi. And she's here on behalf of her co-authors Anna Kim and also Zihang Yi. And we'll be talking more about her paper, which is her article, I should say, which is coming out in the September issue of JAR. So we're talking about it before it comes out, which is always exciting. And it's looking at virtual influencers. Specifically, it's called Sponsorship Disclosure and Virtual Influencer Marketing, Assessing User Sentiment and Engagement Toward Virtual Influencer Endorsements. So thank you so much for being on, Jamin.
Yeah, thank you for having us. To talk a little bit more on our study, what we're trying to do with this is to really understand or explore how the presence versus the absence of sponsorship disclosure changes the way people respond to virtual influencer endorsements.
Awesome. Yeah, it's a very topical area as well too, because I know virtual
Mhm.
influencers have been, something we've been discussing a lot in academic circles, and we're seeing more and more of them. And then especially with Gen AI, it's becoming even easier to potentially start one and, create more of these virtual influencers and put them out there.
Yeah, definitely. In this research, we actually focus on people's parasocial interactions with Lil Michaela, who is a really prominent virtual influencer that has amassed a substantial following on social media and also clinched a really impressive portfolio of brand partnerships. And so, in this paper, we really drew upon the persuasion knowledge model to also test whether its tenets are generalizable from human agents to virtual agents as well.
Oh, that's very cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you a bit more about like what you actually like looked at and how you actually studied that. But before we get into that, just for people who may not be familiar with what the persuasion knowledge model is, could you like briefly
Mhm.
describe what that is?
So I think to put it really simply, it's kind of like how people accumulate knowledge about the agents, the messages, and for example, whatever tactics that they have used to persuade people. And people use that knowledge accumulated over time to inform their subsequent recognition as well as somewhat defensive responses to persuasion attempts in the future. Yeah, so that's what we kind of looked at in the paper as well.
Oh, okay. So it's like if people are also sort of reluctant or defensive when they see a virtual
Mhm,
influencer
mhm.
they know is trying to sell them something in the same way that they
Yes.
would be with a human, right?
Yeah.
Awesome.
So
Okay.
we
So
kind of contrasted non-sponsored content as well as sponsored content based on the FTC's guidelines on content creation. So hashtag ad, hashtag sponsored, as well as paid partnership labels.
oh, okay, very cool.
Mhm.
So tell me more about like what did you do in terms of the studies that you ran, and then tell me a bit more about
Mhm.
the findings as well too.
So we actually used a mixed method approach. So in study one, we did a series of computational analysis based on the user comments that were responding to Lil Michaela's Instagram post. And the first thing we did was topic modeling, where we found that users provided really polarized responses regardless of sponsorship disclosure. So for example, people were confused about Lil Michaela, whether she was a human or a robot.
A lot of
Some
people are,
users,
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
some people were also expressing their admiration for Lil Michaela's beauty, but others were really disgusted, felt creeped out, and really uneasy by her humanoid visual appearance. We also found that some users wanted to befriend or meet Lil Michaela in real life, but some other people expressed their intent to unfollow her on social media because they were so tired of the drama that she was involved in.
Yeah.
Hmm. And then besides that topic modeling, we understood that there was polarized responses. So we went one step further with sentiment analysis of the text and the emojis and the user comments. And we found that actually users expressed significantly more positive sentiment towards sponsored versus non-sponsored posts. And this was
Hmm.
contrary to what the persuasion knowledge model predicted. We also found that, in fact, sponsorship disclosure amplified the asymmetry of user comments conveying positive versus negative sentiment. And then the
So it was like,
emoji analysis, yes. So text analysis said that, persuasion knowledge model, it doesn't really apply. People actually feel more positively towards sponsored content. Yeah, and then as I was saying, for emoji analysis, we found a slightly different picture where, regardless of sponsorship disclosure, user comments were primarily featuring positive emojis, anyways. So, in reconciling the polarized responses from the topic modeling, as well as the really primarily positive sentiments in the sentiment analysis, we went one step further again and replicated that with user engagement. So, this added a behavioral component to the
Hmm.
comparisons. What we found was actually in support of the persuasion knowledge model this time because non-sponsored posts yielded significantly greater user engagement than sponsored posts. And then we conducted an online experiment and we replicated that pattern for user engagement in study one. So in this online experiment, we controlled for perceived familiarity as well as the perceived human likeness of Lil Michaela. And what we found was in support of the persuasion knowledge model, which meant that non-sponsored posts yielded significantly greater intention for parasocial interaction as well as user engagement. And then besides that, we also did find a little bit of mixed support for persuasion knowledge model in the sense that sponsorship disclosure didn't predicts persuasion knowledge. In fact, users with greater persuasion knowledge exhibited greater intent for parasocial interaction and post engagement. So, this is kind of opposite to what the persuasion knowledge model predicted in a sense. And even when we added a note for pro social donations, this didn't offset the effects for sponsorship disclosure as well.
Wow. Okay, so there's a lot going on. Yeah, it seems like
Yeah.
there's definitely a mixed bag of sort of responses we're getting from people.
Mhm.
So help me sort of unpack this for people who are listening. It seems like people like the virtual influencer more, but they don't seem to actually engage with the virtual influencer as much as a regular influencer. Is that correct?
We're not really comparing regular influencers here. We're just focusing on Lil Michaela. But what we found was that even though topic modeling revealed polarized responses, when you're looking at sentiment analysis in terms of the distribution of text and emojis, people were still primarily positive in terms of their sentiment toward the sponsored post. So if you're looking at engagement and um, intention for parasocial interactions, this tells a different story. This is really aligned with what the persuasion knowledge model predicts. But if you look at the express behavioral intentions, express emotions in terms of the user
Hmm.
comments, this doesn't follow the pattern for persuasion knowledge model.
What
Yeah.
do you think is causing that gap?
So I think the gap is also what we commonly notice in a lot of social science research, where there is a discrepancy between what people express in their behavioral intentions, as well as, for example, what actually happens on social media. Yeah, so I think this is also something that prompted us to really look into this study. One of our ideas, which is that we wanted to bridge that discrepancy between behavioral intention as well as actual behaviors on social media, which was why we replicated the findings with behavioral scraping as well as an online experimental component.
Okay, interesting. Okay, so you're seeing that gap, and it's coming through for the experiment as well too. And
Hmm.
so again, a
Hmm.
lot kind of like going on here, but maybe I'll just sort of it's a nice sort of segue into the next question. So, what does
Yeah.
this mean? Like, what does this mean for people working in advertising? Like, should they use sponsored? Should they put the disclosure or not? Like, is it better to do that? Is it not? Like, what should they expect? What's kind of the key takeaways for them? Yeah.
Yeah, so we found a lot of like polarized findings as well. So I think there are three key takeaways from here. So the first one would be that brands actually need to employ multifaceted methods for quantifying the advertising performance of virtual influencer endorsements. Because we do see conventional engagement metrics like your number of likes, comments, and shares, they are really relevant and they follow the patterns predicted by the persuasion knowledge model. However, it is also
Which would
really
be
crucial.
lower or yeah.
Yeah, so it would be lower for sponsored posts as compared to
Okay. Yeah.
non-sponsored posts. Yeah.
Yeah.
But we noticed that it's really also crucial to understand the underlying sentiments and express behavioral intentions. So not just looking at the number of comments on each Instagram post, but to also account for people who might be potentially leaving hate comments on these posts as well. So that could be what was contributing to the somewhat opposite contrasting findings in a sense.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think a second takeaway would be also that brands really need to be cautious about whether virtual influencers will engender uncanny valley effects, such as being creeped out, feeling uneasy, or even disgusted, because this might actually hinder parasocial interaction. So, in a sense, brands should really collaborate with AI experts and creators to, first of all, refine the virtual influencer's appearance, their persona, and content to ensure that it doesn't really convey inconsistencies in human likeness, because this is a precondition for the uncanny valley effects to occur. Now, I think it is also really important, as you mentioned, that they provide transparent disclosures about the virtual influencers' artificiality in their behavior, in their bio, as well as their posts on social media to prime them and to kind of like stop them in
Tripping
terms
them
of
up.
their
Yeah.
expectations.
Yeah, that's really interesting as well too. And you've mentioned parasocial relationships a lot, and we're both familiar with that. But I'm just curious if you could just briefly explain that as well too for people who may not be as familiar with that phenomenon.
Yes, definitely. So parasocial interactions, conceptually, it's kind of defined as people's illusory, one-sided kind of imagined um, relationship bonds with like a social media personality or a media character. This is applied to real characters and has also been observed for fictional characters as well, which is why it is a really appropriate kind of concept to use in this research. But what we did was that we also looked at Dibble et al.'s piece on what parasocial interactions versus relationships, what they actually mean. And that is why we follow the explication of parasocial interactions having kind of like a cognitive aspect, which was reflected in their confusion on whether Lil Michaela is robot or human. The affective responses, which was what informed our sentiment analysis. Do people feel good or do they feel bad towards Lil Michaela, as well as the behavioral component, which was the parasocial interaction intention, as well as user engagement and engagement intention as well. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that's super helpful, for people. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think another takeaway going back to that question was that virtual influencer creators really also need to balance the mix of contents that they have for their virtual influencers. So we noted that non-sponsored content is actually really essential for users' relationship building with the virtual influencers, while sponsored content should actually be deployed a lot more selectively. So disclosures about pro-social endorsements, which means your collaborations or even involvement with nonprofit organizations, these are equally susceptible to the dip in user engagement, which
Right.
is the persuaded knowledge models predictions. Yeah.
Yeah. That's super interesting. Yeah. So I'm also curious as well to always ask every author or team this as well. Like, where did the idea come from? I think it's always great looking at the story behind it. Yeah.
Yeah, so this also ties back to what we talked about earlier in terms of the discrepancy between self-reported measures as well as actual behaviors. That was one of the motivations for the study
Oh,
in terms
okay.
of the mixed method approach. The other thing was that, to be really honest, I get a lot of my ideas from doom scrolling on Instagram. And
Oh,
it
that's
was really good
fantastic.
to,
Yeah.
yeah, to feed that curiosity with the understanding of what was going on in the field. So in this sense, what we noticed was that yes, influencer endorsements and persuasion knowledge model, they have been studied for a really long time and really extensively, but the findings mostly pertain to human influencers and virtual influencer endorsements, as you pointed it out in the beginning, they have rapidly gained a lot of popularity, but there were open questions about how sponsorship disclosures work when the persuasive agent is not human, but it's
Right.
virtual. Yeah.
Yeah.
So will people treat little Michaela like a human influencer, given that she has a really human-like visual appearance and because she has so much emotional complexity?
Yeah. And your findings show it's complicated. It's
Yeah,
not
it's
quite
really complicated.
it's not easy, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it really depends on what aspect, like affective, cognitive, or behavioral kind of outcomes you're looking at, which ties back to the need for multifaceted measures for advertising performance.
Yeah, that's really important. So, I mean, if they're just using engagement, then, if an agency is using engagement to track the performance of their influencers, right, they would see that they're
Mhm.
all doing worse. But there may be certain ways that, if they looked at what was it, the sentiment around it, right, they would be doing
Yeah.
better on that perspective, right? Yeah.
Mhm.
Awesome. So next big question is challenges. I'm always like curious as well too. If there were any challenges
Mhm.
that you encountered when going through and doing this research.
Yes, definitely. So on the technical side, we worked with about 50,000 Instagram comments, and that was pretty messy. So people don't write in complete or neat sentences. They
No.
use slang. Yeah, they use emoji, even irony, contradictions within the same comments. And dictionary-based sentiment analysis really struggles with this. So we found a large portion of text and emojis that simply weren't captured in the dictionary lexicon. So we felt that we had to triangulate that with multiple approaches, which explains the topic modeling, the sentiment analysis for text compared with sentiment analysis for emojis to get a more accurate sentiment scoring and a more holistic, comprehensive picture as well. Um, Another challenge was the self-selection bias. So the people leaving comments may not represent the average Instagram user. They may be fans or critics with stronger opinions toward Lil
Yeah.
Michaela, which is why we added the experimental components and study to really test responses in a
Yeah.
more controlled environment.
It's really nice to be able to look at it from the
Yeah.
different perspectives. Yeah.
And I think on the conceptual side, because we just talked about technical difficulties, but on the conceptual side, the biggest challenge, as we saw, was interpreting all the contradictions in terms of findings. So, for example, why would people express more positive sentiment to its sponsored posts, but engage less with them? And why would there be higher persuasion knowledge when it correlates, higher persuasion knowledge, how that correlates with more willingness to interact? So, these patterns don't really align neatly with established models. So this really forced us to think, okay, why does the
Yeah.
persuasion knowledge offer a little bit more differently in a virtual agent context? Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's super interesting. It's always I personally find that challenging as well too, going through and looking at something. I'm like,
Mhm.
am I wrong? Is the data wrong? Or is it something else going on, right? So
Yeah, and I had to really check, like, did I code it wrongly? Why is it contrary to what the persuasion knowledge found? So this was good because it really forced us to check the results again and again. But this also pointed out to the need for, as I said, more multifaceted approaches in terms of measuring the parasocial interaction and also internal replication using a mixed method approach.
yeah, that's fantastic to see. Yeah. So
Mhm.
where to next? Given you got such interesting findings, like what do you propose as, the most interesting sort of places to go to follow up on this research?
Yes, so we have quite a few ideas. So the first would be longitudinal research. So our data set covered Lil Michaela's post from 2017 all the way to 2022, but we didn't analyze the changes over time. So in this sense, a time series approach could reveal how people's responses evolve as they become more familiar with virtual influencers and how they respond as the technological novelty of virtual influencers wears off.
That would be cool. Yeah.
Another idea would be the diversity in influencers. So not all virtual influencers look like little Michaela. Some look more anime style and they are more overtly cartoonish. So
Hmm.
this is about whether they trigger the same uncanny valley or sense of discomfort, or whether those cartoonish influencers would totally bypass that uncanny valley effect because users just don't expect them to be human-like. I think another future direction would be linguistic cues. And this is something really helpful and really promising that was pointed out to us by the reviewers. So, in this context, something as subtle as pronouns might matter, but this in conventional approaches of computational analysis, pronouns will be considered as stop words or something semantically inconsequential. So, if a virtual influencer is referred to as it, versus being referred to as she, her, does that change
Hmm.
empathy, trust, and homophily? So I think we suspect that it could have a significant effect in terms of parasocial bonding and persuasion, and definitely it will be worth looking at in the future as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
That's quite cool. Cool. Well, awesome. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing more about your exciting article. I'm very excited to see it come out in September as well too. So next month it'll be out in print and available for people to read. Of course, people can always go online right now and find it as well
Mhm.
on our website. And for those who are
Yeah,
interested,
great.
again, it's called, I'm sorry, it's called Sponsorship Disclosure and Virtual Influencer Marketing, Assessing User Sentiment and Engagement Toward Virtual Influencer Endorsements.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me again.
No, of course,
I really
Jamin. Yeah,
appreciate it. Yeah.
awesome. So thank you again, and I hope to see more exciting research coming in from your team.
Thank you.